Each year, I undertake a motorcycle pilgrimage to see my family. I, of course, see them more than once just a year, but at least one time each summer, I make a point of riding my bike across the eastern part of the country to visit. Normally, I would ride to Indiana, where I'm from and my parents are, but this year we decided to convene the clan at my sister's home in Michigan. By order of Pythagoras, this takes a little longer than riding from DC to Indiana, though, so I decided to turn what is usually a weekend trip either way into a Friday night plus weekend trip on either end. So, after work on Friday, I headed out to shave off about 100 miles from the total. The temperature was really lovely, but I played cat and mouse with a line of scattered thunderstorms for the whole evening, having to change my route up a little bit to avoid the worst clumps of it. By a combination of luck and checking the radar app, I managed to not get properly rained on at all, just a little bit wet from riding through places that had recently been rained on, which is pretty tolerable. I stopped for some Chipotle because I wasn't entirely sure where I'd camp for that night and figured it would be better to not have to worry about cooking too. After meandering through the hills of western Maryland for a while, I ended up in Paw Paw at a campsite near the C&O Canal. I figured there'd be other campers there on a Friday, but there wasn't a soul but me and then a guy who came up from the river with some catfish that he'd caught. I set my tent up in the dark and settled in, knowing that there was some more storms coming in overnight, but I was well and truly ensconced in my tent by the time the rain started to fall.
Get our crap off here.
In the morning, there was a fine mist covering the tops of the hills and dew all over the tent. I had some breakfast and packed my things to get back on the road. I'd mostly gotten through Maryland, so the goal today was to cover all of West Virginia and part of Ohio. I had made some reservations at Finley State Park, making for roughly a 300-mile day. The windy roads of West Virginia are always a treat to ride. Even though the surface isn't always 100%, there's rarely a straight stretch, and there's usually any number of trees and hills and rivers to embellish the view. The only downside for a motorcyclist is the weather. Appalachia tends to get more rain than most places, and this certainly squares with my experience. I usually get rained on somewhere on my trips, which is to be expected, but the batting average for Appalachia is considerably higher than anywhere else. All this to say, I wasn't too surprised when waiting at a stoplight, a guy in a car next to me yelled at me and said that I might want to find somewhere to wait up for a while because there was some rain coming. Sure enough, about 2 minutes after that interaction, it started to rain. Nothing too bad, but I did stop at the first pull-off I found, which happened to be an abandoned old car wash. Perfect spot to stop and put on some rain gear. Set back off into the light rain, which eventually gave way again to sunshine. When the rain came back, it came back with a vengeance. The kind of rain where you can see a wall coming toward you. But even this was temporary, and soon enough the sun was out again. So I stopped for a sandwich at a little Italian deli in Washington, Pennsylvania to dry off and enjoy a Reuben and a coffee. Thus rejuvenated, it was time to keep heading west, eventually crossing the Ohio River into the hilly southeastern corner of the Buckeye State. Google took me on some real back road jaunts through this part of the state. Some parts of the country you can turn on the avoid highways setting and mostly be on state roads, but in this more rural part of the state, it'll send you along some real unmarked and sometimes almost unpaved roads. Southeastern Ohio is quite nice to ride. It's all gentle rolling hills and a mix of forests and farms. As you move northwest through the state, though, it begins to flatten out, becoming the glaciated plain that's the hallmark of much of the agricultural Midwest. After a few hours of riding, I arrived at Finley State Park, where I had a campsite for the night. The park is nice, but the campground was fairly crowded. Thankfully, I had a spot at the end of a loop, so it was a little bit quieter, but definitely would have preferred a site in a national or state forest. Unfortunately, there are not very many of those around here, so state parks are the best option. I set up my tent and unloaded my things, then went down to the water nearby to fish for a bit. I found a little cove where I unsuccessfully tried my luck. I did see a very sizable catfish swim out at one point though, but he was not interested in my bait. After a while, I went back to my site to have some food and read for a bit before turning in. The next morning, I once again had my champion's breakfast of tea and a granola bar, read for a bit, and then packed my stuff up again. I only had another 300 miles or so before my final destination in Michigan. I filled up my Camelback at the water spigot and then carried on my merry way into the morning sun.
All right.
The roads at this point were straightened out, no longer the curvy ones at the southeastern part of the state. Roads here will run for dozens of miles without so much as a hiccup of a turn. On the way, though, I got a glimpse of the most certifiably insane kind of pilot, a crop duster. As I was riding along, I saw a blur of yellow dip behind the trees, and so I pulled off to observe. The pilot was out spraying in the local fields, taking nerves of steel to fly that close to a power line. A bit further down the way, I went through Toledo, the home of Jeep and once of glass production. The parts of the city I rode through seemed a little bit down on their luck, lots of potholes. On the far side of town, though, I rode by the University of Toledo campus, and Glass City looked a little better over there. After passing Toledo, I was pretty much in Michigan. Before I got to my sister's place, I wanted to stop and get a gift for my niece. I had gifts in tow from a trip to Italy from the rest of my family, and of course I couldn't leave out the youngest, so I ended up stopping in a little town called Tecumseh, which had a little toy store on the main drag. I got coffee and some shawarma there, and then acquired a calico critter for my niece, and set off on the last few hours of riding. I got to my sister's place in time for dinner, and my parents had come up for the week too, so what more could you ask for? I remote worked for the week there with my family, alongside a few jaunts out. We went out to the lake at one point, and even took a nice little chain-operated ferry across at Saugatuck. The week was a pleasant blur, but the next weekend rolled around and it was time to do the same expedition all over again.
I love you. See you guys.
Just like the way here, I left on a Friday evening to get about 100 miles out of the way.
See what?
That's a good sound.
Yeah. Bye, babe. Bye, sweetie. Alrighty, guys.
I love you.
Love you guys.
was a lovely evening to be out on the bike, and the sun was nearly setting by the time I got to Lake Hudson Recreation Area where I was staying for the evening. The area was alright as a spot, but nothing to write home about. There were folks a little too close in their RVs with the generators running all night, but the campsites were at least somewhat surrounded by grass and trees. And the sunset was beautiful. In the morning, I had made a sad discovery. I had stashed my gas canister inside my little stainless steel cup, the bottom of which had rusted and left little rust rings in my teacup. Not the end of the world, I just made tea in my pot instead, but still a bummer. I had a decent bit of riding to get done today, so I decided to pack up and head to the closest town to get breakfast at a diner, something a little more substantial than just a granola bar. I headed just a few miles down the road to the town of Morenci, just right above the Ohio border. I stopped at a little place called the Village Inn and got an omelet. It was a rough and ready little place, but the coffee was hot and the omelet was decent, and it came with rye, so I was happy enough. After that, it was time to roll into Ohio and cross the entirety of the Buckeye State to get to my destination for the night, just across the Ohio River, barely into West Virginia, at a nice little spot called Mountwood Park. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. There was still all of Ohio to get through before I was there on the lakeside. The weather was perfect for riding, sunny and balmy, not too hot. Since I was avoiding the highway, it was a lot of stops and a few miles east, a few miles south, a few miles east, a few miles south kind of riding. As I was riding along, I did have my lone mechanical error for the trip, a pretty paltry one at that. I looked down and realized that my speedometer wasn't working anymore, so I just found a spot, pulled over, and lo and behold, it had come unthreaded from the speedometer. I just threaded it back on and carried on my way.
That should be better this time.
About as minor an inconveniences as possible on a trip like this.
Yeah. I have an intrusive thought.
Google took me on some pretty gravelly B roads around this part of the state, a place where seeing yellow signs with a horse and buggy is pretty common. By late afternoon, I'd gotten to Zanesville, where I stopped to grab a bite to eat. There was a Caribbean restaurant in town, so I decided to stop there and got some jerk chicken with some rice and peas and cabbage. I spent a decent chunk of time in college in Jamaica in the mountains on a farm, so jerk chicken and rice and peas is a somewhat reminiscent meal for me from time to time. Belly full, I hammered out the last 2 hours of the ride, pretty much following the curving banks of the Muskingum River the whole way. I still had a decent chunk of daylight to spare when I finally got to Mountwood Park in West Virginia, so I picked myself a campsite near the lake and set up my gear before going on an ill-fated attempt to catch some fish. Alas, some bites, but no fish this evening. Of course, the purpose of fishing isn't really to catch fish, it's to stand near the water and hear the sounds of the lake water and hear the birds call in the trees. Whether you hook a fish is almost immaterial, to me at least. In the morning, the lake was covered in fine mist. It was time to reassemble my migratory life back into the side cases and get on the road again. By this point, the end was closer to the beginning, so I was looking forward to being back home, but there were some lovely roads to cover between here and there. Navigation for the day was quite simple. No need for Google Maps in the headphones today. Go down the road, turn right onto 50, continue for 130 miles till I get to Mount Storm, then pop down to 48 there, and then continue heading east, young man. Eastern West Virginia is a great ribbon of pavement. Parts are 2-lane highways, but once you get past Bridgeport, it's basically just a single lane. The scenery is lovely, and there's barely a straight quarter mile the whole way. The sun was shining and the pavement was dry, so it was perfect for riding. Once down to 48, the road became a little more akin to a highway again, so I stopped for a short break to watch the windmills for a bit. From there, it was more or less a straight shot back to Front Royal, where I could hop back on 66 and laser the rest of the way home. Once I get on 66 on the way home from a longer trip like this, it always feels like the home stretch. Compared to the rest of the miles, they're probably some of the fastest I travel, but they sometimes feel the longest. After more than 1,000 miles, in a way the last 60 feel longer. The journey's mostly over at this point, and part of you is happy for it, but there's still that voice in your head that tells you to keep going, keep the wheels turning, see something new. For now, the voice is quiet, but it calls a little louder every day when you're home, and soon enough, the road will be calling and it'll be time to go again.